Without further ado, we have our special guest here, Michael C. Martin. Hi, Michael. How are you? Thanks for coming.
I'm good. How's everybody?
Good, good. Very, very happy to have you here. So I'm gonna get off now, and I'm gonna hand it over to you. I'm gonna read your bio here and introduce you, and then I'll give you the show.
Okay. Sounds
Okay,
good.
so Michael C. Martin has more than 15 years experience in the film and TV industry as a writer, producer, and director. In 2008, he was recognized by Variety magazine as one of the top 10 screenwriters to watch, offering a rare blend of genre work that spans westerns, horror, cop, and music. Michael has a flair for penning grounded characters of endless backgrounds. Michael holds a bachelor's degree in film production from Brooklyn College, and he is born and raised in Brooklyn. Michael is currently based in Los Angeles. So, Michael C. Martin, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for having me. How's everybody doing? This is so interesting to kind of do this over Zoom. I still remember when I was a student and someone would show up that was working in the film industry, and we'd all get so excited and kind of buzz about the idea of meeting someone who works in the field we're trying to get into. And eventually there would always someone would say, I'm going to ask how much money they make. It would always come up. And we had one kid that would always ask, which is really interesting and fun. Immediately, that's what pops into my mind doing this. Um, it's a screenwriting class, so I'm sure you guys, are very fluent about the language of film and about the idea of writing something and how it can open up to others' interpretation. And I have to say, for myself, as a film student and being in your position, that was always something that I had a complete blinders to in every possible way. Unfortunately, I only took one screenwriting class when I was in Brooklyn College. It was a short writing class, and that was about it. But I have to say, the mass of everything that I learned at Brooklyn College really kind of put me on the trajectory that I needed to go on. So I think what I wanted to present to you as students is what I learned being in your position as a film student and then entering into the film and TV industry. I think the first thing that blew me away was that a vast majority of the people that work in the film and TV industry on the creative side have not gone to film school. Most of the writers that I've worked with have not gone to film school at all. No experience. They're journalists, lawyers, doctors. They've come from a massive field. And as far as creative executives, film executives, TV executives, I would say I've never met one of them that's gone to film school. So that is not what I expected when I was in your position. And seeing some people shake their heads, I'm sure that maybe shocked you as well. So definitely in my presentation, what I wanted to bring to you is what is the reality that I faced in my career because of that, and what I think you might also face while going off into the film and TV world. Just to give you kind of a quick bulletin of just how I got into this industry in the first place. Uh, at Brooklyn College, I wanted to be, first I wanted to be a DP, but I didn't have enough OCD to be a DP. So then from there, I switched to directing, which is what I loved. I enjoyed directing, talking to actors. I wrote a script. It was one of the two scripts that were chosen at the program at that point, and so I made a short film. I got to a couple of festivals, and I was really excited to go and make another short film to get into another festival, but I got into a car accident. And so while I was recuperating, there are no directing contests, but there was a screenwriting contest. My roommate at the time was in the police academy, and I had all of these ideas about a cop movie, and I just wrote something, put it in a contest. I didn't win the contest, but through a contact at that contest, which was the IFP New York, she was able to get me in contact with uh, agents in LA. I signed with an agent. A week later, I went on a job interview. I got the job. And then I moved to LA. Now, when I moved to LA and I told people this story, everyone explained to me that this does not happen. So don't have the expectations that you just write one script and then you put it in a contest and a bunch of people just get you a job. It happened extremely fast for me, very quickly. I immediately went from having no desire to work on a television show to having a TV job in a week. So I had a lot of catching up to do in this industry. I had to learn pretty much that this is a completely different space than Brooklyn and film school in every possible way. What I will say in the big, larger highlights of what has happened to me in my career, which was getting my first job, I'd say about 2006 to now, is that what you learn is that every writer has a voice. Everyone right now on the Zoom call has a voice, something about you that makes you who you are. I think there's a very famous quote by Quentin Tarantino. If my mother hadn't have met my father, my movies wouldn't exist, which is an easy example to see with Tarantino. No one else makes those movies. He has something very specific about him. So everyone here has something very specific about themselves that makes you write a scene a certain way, which makes you plant a joke a certain way, or set up the tone a certain way. You know, for me, I grew up in East New York, Brooklyn. I went to film school. Everything in my life was pretty local and pretty much a very typical Brooklyn upbringing, which is why I would write a movie called Brooklyn's Finest. And then you start to kind of branch out and your world expands, and all of a sudden the way that you write expands. If I can give any kind of a full example of what I think that happened for me was growing up in New York and going to film school, I would meet a lot of theater actors and I would love the theater. Theater to me was still the best thing possible. So when I write a lot of dialogue. Like I think Brooklyn's Finest is pretty much wall to wall of dialogue. So having written like this from my kind of inception of being a writer, because Brooklyn's Finest is my first script, what I learned in this industry is that it's very difficult to maintain wall-to-wall dialogue in a film or a television show. Eventually, you're going to have some visuals or have to have something that's a little smaller. So the change in the style of which I've written my voice versus this industry, which is going to happen to everyone in this business. When you write, eventually your voice and where the industry meets is going to change. There was a scene that I wrote for a movie that came out on Quibi called #FreeRaySean. And what involved in this scene was that this couple was in the middle of this huge problem, like catastrophe in their outward life, because they were police officers in a hostage situation, and then within their personal life, within their relationship, something huge had happened. So they've got all of this huge stuff to unpack and talk about. And so now there's a scene where they're going to talk about these issues. And in the past, I would have written 9 pages. And now being the writer I am and working in the industry, the scene that was written was 1/3 of a page. And the main character walks into the room and he sits down and it's very awkward and his wife won't look at him. And then eventually he says, "I'm sorry and I love you." And then he moves closer. She still won't look at him. He says, "I'm sorry and I love you." And then she looks at him and then they hug. And that is kind of one of a big trajectory for me as a writer, because I didn't need to put in all the emotions. The actors, the director, everyone else involved in the production could have made an impact. That's probably one of those kind of big, long lessons that you kind of learn further in writing, which is you can always write and rewrite a scene. But the great thing about working in this industry in the time of my career is I've learned why those things need to change. And I think as everyone matures as a writer, you start to figure out those things. But one of the big lessons, I think, is because having gone to film school and watched an alternative way of movies being made, breakthrough ways, I was always kind of clashing against this industry in a way. So what I think I wanted to present to you guys was where me, someone who loves the art of film and obscure indie movies and art house films, I then had to have meetings at Paramount and Warner Brothers and you know, Greg Berlanti's company in television, and they have a completely different style. And so I learned to adapt more to the studio style. It doesn't change my voice. It just makes it merge in a certain place. So what I wanted to do, and hopefully Frank can pull it up because I'm not tech savvy at all, is I did present this kind of paradigm called Save the Cat. Now, I don't know if anybody knows about Save the Cat at all, but in an industry where most of the people that are working in it have not gone to film school, and they are not drawing from their projects that they've been making and spent money on and lights that they've had to haul, they adapt a very different system. And so Save the Cat in some way or another is pretty much the system that's at work at any studio system or any major system out here in Los Angeles. So if you kind of look at some of the big beats, and I can't match them out, but on the bottom, you'll see thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. This is pretty much in the most clear possible way. This is how major movie studios, producers tend to break down what your script is as a movie. And when I say thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, which means take Warner Brothers Studios. Now, Warner Brothers Studios, Harry Potter is a big success for them because they have this tremendous apparatus that if a film is made of grand quality and crossover ability to 4 quadrants out here means male and female above 25 and below 25. So if you have a man above 25, if he enjoys it, if a man below 25 would also enjoy this, if a woman over 25 would enjoy this, and a woman under 25 would enjoy it, it's a 4-quadrant film. It has the possibility to make the most money. So Warner Brothers can make a Harry Potter film, and Harry Potter can generate about $2 billion in revenue. And because it can generate $2 billion in revenue, and because all of these departments have to be involved and work in a symbiotic way, what they're looking for is a very simple way to explain what movie they're making. Years and years ago, I had a meeting at Paramount, and one of the executives was leaving a meeting for Transformers. And I grew up on Transformers, loved Transformers, and this was going to be the movie of my youth. And I remember the executive explained that they figured out the movie, that someone explained that the whole movie is about a kid who gets his first car. And he's like, that's it. That's the whole movie. And I had a face of stone because I thought that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Like, this is the reason why movies suck. Who cares? This is supposed to be this intergalactic movie of my youth, not about a kid in his first car. Now, what I learned about why that for them was a success is because in every language, in every culture, every gender, every age, someone has some connection to the idea of owning a car. Therefore, I don't have to conjure anything else new for you to take in the experience of the film. You inherently will immediately understand. And when we go to market it in Brazil and China and all these places, everything will be understood. So the filmmakers are taking an approach where, because they understand an apparatus, they've created their story to fit a corporate model. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody has to make these types of movies. These are not my favorite types of films. But as film students, it's very helpful to understand that when you write a script, these are the critiques that people are going to make on your story. They're going to expect it to fit into a certain paradigm. Doesn't mean you have to make it fit into it, but you should know whenever you're making something and you deviate from what is expected, why they're going to have that reaction to it. Now, I'm going to talk about a film that I'm sure everybody has seen, but it's very useful to break it down to understand as a creator why certain things are widely accepted, considered to be marketable and profitable, and why some things are not. So Titanic, not one of my favorite films, but it is probably one of the greatest examples that people will use in terms of big movie screenwriting. Now, if you take Titanic, the Titanic is a disaster. This is the expectation that you're supposed to go into this film, which is, I know this disaster happened, and I'm going to watch a film recreate this disaster. Now, we don't like to see movies that are negative. Big studio movies don't have the sense of walking out and you're just like, that was horrible. Instead, you walk out in a positive and uplifting place. So how is it that you can make a movie about Titanic that's uplifting? Well, the way into it, which is when I say the bottom row is so important, is the movie starts in such a way where there's a search for a diamond. And we're led to believe that this diamond is of some mystery that we care about. But the diamond means nothing. The diamond is a complete MacGuffin. The diamond is an excuse to get into the film, because the final image of Titanic, which is the old woman takes the diamond and she throws it down into the ocean, and it goes right back down to the bottom. It's never found. The mystery of the beginning of the movie is never solved in any way that we care about, because that's not the point of the movie. The point of the movie is Rose is the only passenger of this disaster whose life is a success. Because the character of Rose, if not for the disaster, if not for the Titanic sinking, she would have landed in New York and she would have lived a horrible life. That was the purpose of the buildup of the movie, to make us understand that we're not going to see all of the lives lost in the Titanic. We're going to celebrate a life lived and a life saved, which is uplifting, which might sound very saccharine, but if you look at a marketing tool of a movie, it allows you to understand the music that needs to come into play. It allows you to understand what the poster needs to feel like. We're going to go watch a celebration of life, which allows a studio to feel comfortable spending $200 million on it. Which means if that is the controlling idea of your narrative, then once you break it down into these subsections that are on the board, they need to support that idea. What happens to Rose very early in the first act? She tries to commit suicide. She doesn't see a life for herself. And so if you're going to make that grand idea, then you have to have the character make that choice, which is also very bold, which is something that happens, I say, not in every storytelling, but this is more so in big studio storytelling. If this is what your story is about, you need to create an event that is very pivotal for the story. Now, if you bookend that moment of Rose, who is choosing to end her life or making a choice to end her life, she then has this character, Jack, who pulls her back in. Now, for the complete circle to take place, and this is in big studio movies, Rose needs to make another monumental choice somewhere within the film. And that monumental choice is at some point she is put on a boat and she is supposed to leave as a survivor. And she refuses to leave as a survivor. Instead, she's going to go with Jack, even if that means death. This is how much this character believes in life. I won't even live life halfway. I have to live life in a place of love, which makes everyone in the movie theater clap. And it's a big, tremendous thing that takes place. Now, I mentioned that in Titanic because that is a moment that you can get in just about any movie. But when I mention it in the terms of Titanic and big budget movies, it's because you're always looking for big swinging moments when you're writing. Now, everyone writes differently and everyone has a different genres and everything they choose. But what I will say about what I've learned in my career is that, especially for an industry that's not moved by film students, whereas if I pitch an idea and you're a film student, you can immediately think about the lighting, the editing. You can think about so many different factors that will enhance the storytelling. But if you are talking to executives who don't have that vast knowledge, and not to say that they aren't aware, everything usually falls into characters and choices. If you look at the bottom, Save the Cat, I think it says in the break into two that the character has to make an active choice. That is something that's very extremely key to big budget storytelling, big movies, is where did the character make an active choice? Now, to further break down Titanic, just for this sake, whenever you're writing, and this is something I learned on Brooklyn's Finest, because Antoine Fuqua was the director, who was a big, huge director. And I wasn't aware that one of his favorite moments in the movie, in the script, Brooklyn's Finest, three characters kind of pass and circle each other. And the way it was written, you know, I always wanted to like become a Steadicam operator. So it was very fluid, the writing. And he told me he loved it. And he said he knew he wanted to design that shot. As writers, and if I don't know if you're a writer who also has the capacity for being a director, directors don't want to simply record your dialogue. Directors are always in some way in a fight to find a way to tell the story without it having to be talking head in that way. That was something I didn't learn until much later in my career. But I think what kind of helped me was one, going to film school, and I've always loved visual storytelling. You know, one of my favorite scenes, I don't know if you've ever seen Once Upon a Time in America, but there's a scene where there's a little kid. He goes to a bakery and he buys a little pastry dish as a means for payment to a child prostitute. And you look at the scene and it's kind of, you know, it's dessert, and then it's something that's kind of filthy that you kind of don't want to see. And the kid sits at the steps waiting for this girl, and he just looks at the pastry and he just kind of stares at it. Eventually he undoes the wrapping. He takes a little piece and taste, and then he eats the entire thing. Somewhere within that time period where he was waiting for the prostitute, he just decided to be a kid, and it just took over. Now, as much as I love a scene like that, a director will love a scene like that. If you made a script that was 85 minutes of moments like that, it wouldn't go over well. But there is something very interesting about the juxtaposition of dialogue and visual storytelling that will serve you extremely well if you want to write movies. Always, I would say, is a great sense of advice. If you can find a scene and you can continue to cut out dialogue to make it visually appealing to be shot, it's going to go a long way in grabbing directors who want your work. Again, it all has to fit with your voice, but that's something that everyone will remedy on their own. Also, I will say that in terms of Titanic, mentioning character actions, actors are very tricky. I don't know how much experience everyone has had working with actors. When you shoot your films and you kind of talk to someone through things, once you meet professional actors, they have a very different approach to things, because they are a commodity in a way. I worked on a television show, and the main writer on the show used to work on a Don Johnson television show. And this is the greatest story you'll ever hear about an actor and star writing. And so they came up with this incredible storyline where it was a cop show and there was a monkey in the show, and the monkey was famous, and this monkey was going to fall in love with the sidekick. And it was an entire storyline about it. And it was very silly the way he explained the storyline. And he explained that the star, Don Johnson, had read the script about the sidekick, the monkey falls in love with the sidekick. And Don Johnson says to the showrunner, "It's a great script, except there's one problem. The monkey would fall in love with me. That's what would happen." What it means by the monkey would fall in love with me, it means if something big is going to happen, I'm the star. It should happen to me. The star doesn't want to witness someone else getting a bigger moment. The star is always in a position to say, if this is the funniest line in the scene, why am I not saying the funniest line? If this is the biggest moment, why don't I take over the biggest moment? If you look at Titanic, Rose and Jack have every big moment that takes place in the film. Now, as a film student, when I would write a script, I felt like the story was the most important person going forward. Now, I don't encourage you to all of a sudden think about Tom Cruise and Denzel Washington in every scene, but whenever you're writing, be very cognizant of the fact that someone is positioning their career with the role that they choose to take on. If there's anything that's said about a lot of screenwriters who happen to get their career positioned really well, it's usually from writing scripts that appeal to a director or an actor to take on. It's one of those things that really does set the tone for your ability to get an agent, your ability to get work, is the fact that this business is being built up by big directors and actors. So when you write in a way that showcases them, it comes off in a very appealing way. So as much as that says a lot about big budget films, I don't think everybody here is probably trying to make the next Titanic. Another genre, the genre that probably gets the most work in the film industry, I would say, are genre films. Genre films falling under a big umbrella, which could be anywhere from an action movie to a romantic comedy to a horror film. I think I've kind of worked on a little bit of everything. I even worked on a horror film called the Vatican Tapes, which to really get down and to break down what my opinion on what genre films mean to the industry and what it means to you as a writer, is that genre films are really big on the hook and the setup of a genre film. So it's looking at it as a means of, if you're a horror writer, if you're a romantic comedy writer, look at the films that get noticed. I don't know if everybody's seen Palm Springs on Hulu. The hook of Palm Springs is, what if there were two people in the movie Groundhog Day? That it gives this kind of immediate sense of, well, I've seen a time travel. I can't say it's time travel, but I've seen a loopy kind of movie before, but I've never seen one where there was two people involved. That feels different. That's kind of what happens in genre films. It's what is the hook, the kind of the first act that steps out and becomes very appealing. Knocked Up is a romantic comedy, which is the hook of that being, what if some guy that you would only sleep with when you were drunk got you pregnant and you decided to keep the baby? That's the hook. That means when you look at the poster, that's what brings you in. That is what Act One kind of brings together. Take a look at the movie The Purge. That once a year for 12 hours, crime is legal. These become the things that grab the attention when you're making or writing a genre script. What is the hook that propels it? I worked on Vatican Tapes, which is a very interesting, weird story. I'll go off into a little bit of a tangent of a story. One of the first jobs that I got when I moved out to LA was to rewrite kind of, I guess you would call it, I don't know. I guess it was like an X-Men-y kind of like script that was being rewritten. These kids who were in their 20s and they had powers because their parents were part of an experiment, and it was called Descendant. So when you die, your powers transfer to your children. And the way contracts work is that you're given 3 steps. So you have to write 3 different drafts to fulfill your contract. So I'd written 2 drafts, and then they fired the director. So they still needed to pay me, but they didn't want to pay me. And so they said, we have another project that's called the Vatican Tapes. And I don't watch horror movies. They're just not my thing at all. But I do like money. So I had to do a rewrite in order to get paid. And the hook of the Vatican Tapes was that there was a woman who goes to the hospital. She's cut her finger and she gets stitches. When she gets the stitches placed in, the stitches are infected. And it causes her to like feel sick, and she has to get them repaired. And every time she goes to the hospital, she gets worse. And so the horror movie kind of builds out of that idea. It always kind of builds out of the idea that something small takes place and then it goes off into a tangent. That being the eventual reveal is that she's the Antichrist. And that kind of becomes a changeover. So, having never written a horror film before and having this kind of task of taking on something I didn't really understand, what became fun about the project, and I'm shocked that it got made, but I'm glad it got made, was that you were always trying to keep this hook going of, I don't know if the problem is medical or supernatural. And not that I think it was a fascinating, amazing idea, but what does hold true with genre films, the same way it holds true with big budget films, is there are certain expectations that you have to meet within the genre. Now you can go to other areas and go to other places with it that people don't expect, but being to show this kind of something flashy is a big momentum in this business. I'll give you two examples of what I mean by being flashy in terms of genres. There's a script that floats around out here in LA. It's called the Tom and Jerry R-rated script. And what someone decided to do, and people should do this, everyone should do this, is they took Tom and Jerry and they decided, I like raunchy comedies. So I'm going to take the characters of Tom and Jerry, who people know, and I'm going to write this kind of R-rated Seth Rogen movie in the heart of it. Now, that movie will never get made because there's no way they're going to allow you the rights of Tom and Jerry to make an R-rated film. But the writer of that script has gotten a ton of work because what they've decided to do is to make something very bold. And writing this spec script, which will never see the light of day, they were able to get a manager and they were able to really get a lot of their work out because they were able to show the merging of two things in a way that was a big hook for people, which is, I've seen raunchy comedies, but I've never seen a cat and a mouse who were part of my childhood discussing divorce and alcoholism. So that I say that to say the genre film writers should always go bold. It always helps. There's also another famous script out here that actually sold for a huge amount of money, which is a shock. One of the first meetings I've ever had, someone explained to me, yeah, there's this script that just sold for $1 million. And they explained to me that all these people wanted to buy it. And he said, this movie will never get made. And I immediately started to scratch my head. I said, well, then why did everyone want to pay for it? And he said, well, that movie does everything we've been told to do as executives. Like, if you look at this chart, there's a reason this chart exists because it gives a big comfort to people to realize whenever you're purchasing something and putting it out into the marketplace, it is going to go up against all of the standards and meet them. Now, here's the reason why it will never get made. This is the story of it. It's a samurai, a Viking, a ninja, a knight, and I think like a cowboy. They all wake up in prison. And then they realize they've all been set up to be put in this prison and go on this dummy mission. And it kind of becomes the usual suspects and the Dirty Dozen all at once. It has no plausible sense in reality. There's no way any of this would ever possibly happen. But someone wrote this into a screenplay, hit every beat that you can see on that board. And a major studio gave them $1 million for it. Now, that movie never got made, but that writer went on to write Predator. He went on to write a lot of films after that. And so what I always have to say to anyone who's a young writer is bold writing always goes a long way, especially with your voice. So, I mean, that being said, that's studio movies, genre movies. I think the last movies that are kind of there are indie films. And what's great about indie films is they don't have to adhere to anything on the board. Indie films are its own making. It's of its own doing. But again, it always, to me, every genre, everything that gets made in this industry, something bold helps move them along. Like The Florida Project is one of my favorite movies of all time. It doesn't follow any paradigm of screenwriting. It just simply allows you to watch these people, watch this thing that's happening out there in the world that you were probably unaware of or was on the peripheral vision, and it's given full frontal view to you. Now, The Florida Project is probably a tough script to write. If I have to say anything that's an indie, that's a good example of writing that's very bold and gets you noticed, I would say, I don't know if everybody's watched Lars and the Real Girl. If you haven't, you should watch it. It's a very interesting indie, and I think one of the best ways, which is, again, a lot of these projects usually have the same thing. If you look at the poster, you're immediately intrigued. Because the poster is a guy holding a sex doll like it's his girlfriend, and that becomes the script. And that's the movie. But it's actually an extremely sweet movie. So it kind of takes you off guard. I think the advice I always tend to give is there's no one way to do anything. But the one way that's usually consistent is don't make safe and ordinary. It's very tough to make safe. What I mean by safe is Lars and the Real Girl is about a guy who opens up and kind of gets out of his loneliness. You know, like you could do that in a very simple story of talking to your neighbor next door. But that's a hard movie to make. But when you make that movie about a guy with a sex doll who goes around his community and everybody accepts the sex doll, that feels like a movie. It feels more like an event. It feels big. Now, don't get me wrong. There's a movie called Pushcart, which is not big at all and does not move things. And is well made, and it's definitely something to watch and enjoy. But if you're talking in terms of trying to get an agent, trying to get a manager, trying to work in this industry, some scripts, which are great, are sometimes tougher to get you noticed and to move forward. That being said, I think I'd probably start talking about television, which I'm sure at this space, because I didn't envision myself being a television writer, but what definitely I think changed was that the landscape of TV changed in a big way, and it opened up things, and most of the indie filmmakers are now showrunners. There's a piece of, it's a document that I wanted to show you guys from Lethal Weapon, which is a show that I worked on. I worked on a little bit of everything at some point. And what's interesting to understand about this document is this is what we call a story doc. Now, a story doc, before I get into like the big breakdown of television, story doc in its basic form is this is the episode in about a page and a half. This is absolutely everything that you're going to find in this episode of television on Lethal Weapon that has to be reduced to a page and a half. Now, it doesn't mean one writer goes off and figures out the episode. What happens is that you get into a kind of this room. Well, this show, we had about 2 rooms. And for weeks, sometimes months, you talk about the episode. And you break down on a full board the characters, what they're going to do, why it's important, why it matters. You get everything fully broken down and discussed, and then someone has to go off and write a story document, which is a page and a half, sometimes 2 pages, and it is a presentation to the executives as to what you plan to do in this episode. Based on reading this story document, they can decide if they don't like a character's action, they don't like the character's motivation, they're a little bit worried about the theme of the episode. It's almost your first try on saying, this is the episode we're going to present to the American people. They can ask for changes, they can sign off and say, go to the next stage, which would be an outline. An outline would be every scene broken down into lines of description. You can write in dialogue, but it's not necessary. It's another stab at, before you get the final script, these are the decisions that we're making. And then from there, eventually you go off and you write the script. The next document that I have is an actual beat sheet of a broken down episode. Now, that's what this represents, is what we call like a board. It probably goes down, I think, for about 5 pages. But the big lesson that I learned in television, one is I didn't want to work in television. So eventually you learn a ton of lessons about television, is I learned that just it's extremely technical, incredibly technical. If to give you the broad sense and understanding what a television show is, someone gives you $150 million and they say, now you need to entertain the American public for 22 episodes over a span of time. You're going to build sets. You're going to shoot on location. You're going to fly people in. You're going to jump out of airplanes. You're going to do a ton of things for $150 million. And then you have to hire all of the people necessary to pull this off. It is a unbelievable, incredible task when you get to see it pulled off right in front of your eyes. Now, everything eventually has to break down into very simple formats. And one of the things that I learned immediately in television is act breaks. Now, I watched television my whole life, and I watched mostly network television growing up. And I remember there's a joke. The joke was they need to find something to put on in between the commercials, meaning that the ads were what were selling and making everything happen. And so the television show is just an excuse to get to the advertisements, that being what they call act breaks. So when you watch a network television show or any television show that has breaks, ads inside of a Hulu show constitute as breaks. And when that breaks up, if you look at old television, or I don't know if you watch This Is Us, what happens is you're supposed to be enticed by the end of an act to watch what's going to happen in the next act. And by keeping that format, once you break down certain types of television shows, eventually there is a system at play in every episode. This is not Lethal Weapon, but in Lethal Weapon, there was a complete structure in every episode. Every episode in Lethal Weapon had to start with an action scene. So as soon as you turn on, somebody was being murdered in some way, somebody was falling out of a building onto a car, something had to happen. So for 22 episodes, we had to figure out what was a flashy murder, body drop that's going to happen in this episode. Now, we call that a procedural because it means every episode will follow the same thing, which means by the time you get to the end of the teaser, it is going to feel like the end of every teaser you watch. By the time you get to the end of Act 1, it's going to feel like every end of Act 1. By the end of Act 2, the same thing. Now, what would happen in Lethal Weapon, and you don't have the board here, you can just simply look at the breakdown of 6 acts. What happened in Lethal Weapon, because it was an action show, was that you needed a body drop as your teaser. The end of Act 1 needed to be an action scene that led to an arrest. But because it's Act 1, the arrest doesn't go anywhere. So at the top of Act 2, you usually get the guy into the interrogation room, and then you find out he couldn't have murdered that guy. He was on The Price is Right at the same time. Something goofy had to happen at that point. So then what took place is that Act 2 would then serve as your second suspect. Your second suspect that would make you feel like you've probably solved the case. So Act 2 would usually end with, this is the second wrong guy that we have by the end in the Act 2 action piece that would take place. So what it allows you to do in Act 3 would then be the emotional act. We then need to see whatever home problems our characters are having because they think they've solved the case. They can now in Act 3 talk about the big problem with my daughter's going to the prom with a guy that I hate. Or I'm thinking about my wife who passed away 5 years ago. Something emotional is taking place. Then by Act 4, based on whatever emotional is happening in your personal life, it gives you insight into the case. Well, maybe that guy we talked to, something else is going on with him. And then act 4 would end in peril because we know who the killer is, but we don't have him in custody. And now he's going to kidnap the person he really wants in act 5, which then would serve to be a big entire action piece in act 5. You catch the bad guy at the end of act 5, and then act 6 is all the fun that you wanted to have in the episode to go out on a good note. Now, that's the procedure for Lethal Weapon. Now, when I started working in television, I had no idea that any of this existed at all. I don't watch a lot of television. Even now, I don't watch a lot of television. Working in television makes you want to watch even less of it. But everything eventually falls down on the network side of things, in the act break side of things. It tends to follow consistent rules in that way. You know, if you have an opportunity to go through the document here, this is for Empire. And Empire has to follow a structure. It's a music show. So eventually there are 2 performances that are going to take place in every show. So eventually, once you're beating out your storyline, you then have to come up with, well, who's going to sing in act 4? And who's going to have the big music performance in act 5? And then who's going to play some music in the studio in act 2? All of these things eventually happen to break down into familiar spaces when watching television. Now, anyone who aspires to work in television, and if you aspire to write, television offers a multitude of places that you can kind of find work in. One of the big lessons that I think I learned in television, having worked on so many different shows, is they do fall under categories. And when the show falls under categories, there are certain things that are super important to that show. One being that I worked on the show Shades of Blue and Lethal Weapon. Shades of Blue and Lethal Weapon fall under a very specific category, which is called a two-hander. Now, that meaning that there are 2 lead characters in that show. Empire would probably fall into that as well. When that means is that when you have 2 stars, the feeling is you need to give their storylines bigger appeal. No one else outshines them. They need to be correct in a scene. They need big moments. You know, one of the big notes that you'll get from a studio very often is, we think this character storyline is way bigger than this character storyline. Or this character storyline feels like it's not meaty enough compared to that character storyline. So what you start to develop in these kind of story breakdowns in the room is, how do we make sure they match up? Now, the way television works, as far as hierarchy, is there's a showrunner. That's the person at the top of the pyramid. Now, below, there are different titles: co-EP, supervising producer, co-producer, executive story editor, staff writer. The showrunner, most of the responsibilities fall on the showrunner, on what's happening in the show, what decisions are being made. But if you break into television any way that you break in, eventually you will have to go to set, which is one of the most important things to do in television. Now, what that means is that you produce the episode that you've written. It gives you a full view on how every decision that you make has a consequence in the show. Now, Empire as a show, it's very difficult to, unless you've watched the show, if you look at certain slug lines, what you're going to see on the slug lines are a tremendous amount of repetition. One of the things about big budget television shows that is, when you build a set for a television show, and whenever you create a world of a television show, if you create a world that is impossible to shoot on a budget, it just won't get, you can't make it. You know, like there are shows like HBO is very famous for creating worlds. Like Westworld is unbelievable. the shape of it, the size, the money it costs. There are certain television shows that now are branching into being monumental and tremendous. Game of Thrones, 20 years ago, no one could imagine television looking like that at all. But what will usually exist are smaller television shows that have to exist on a scaled down budget. And so what ends up happening is you eventually have these dedicated sets that you have to craft a story that will exist on those sets. So Empire, the sets that we have on Empire is you give hero sets to the main characters. Cookie Lion has her own place. The executives that work for her, that storylines are big, they have their own places that are sets that are used consistently. There's a studio, there's a nightclub. Eventually, once you start crafting these stories, if you build out a tremendous chase on the street, depending on the show that you're on, you might hear no. I worked on the show Shades of Blue and Jennifer Lopez, and I can remember it, and it seems crazy to think of. In a production meeting, it was explained to us, oh, we can't have her drive a car, put on the brakes and get out. It's just going to take us way too long. We just don't have the money for that. You have to find a cheaper way to get this done. Now, the reason that happens is because that's a top-heavy show. Almost 60% of the budget on that show is spent on the talent and the producers. So it means it's one of the most expensive. It was one of the most expensive shows on television, but it didn't look expensive. Like the most expensive thing on that show was Jennifer Lopez. So you kind of are hit with these realities of crafting an episode, and then all of a sudden, be it the showrunner, be it the production manager, somebody comes to you and explains you need to lose 2 locations because we just can't shoot there. So that's why a board is ideal in television, because by constantly having something that you look up here story-wise and location-wise, as the production moves and turns, and as you start to realize, well, you're $100,000 over budget. Well, what are you going to do? Well, let's cut this character storyline. We don't have to pay that actor. That'll cut off $60,000 from the budget. All of those things are kind of this constant thing that you're morphing. And I'm pretty sure in everybody's writing, they probably use some system of charting what they're doing in some way. In television, it is absolutely, completely necessary. There's no way to make a television show without constantly charting absolutely everything at every moment that happens, because anything can be moved at any time. I've been in situations on television shows where sometimes you've had to take out $1 million. That's that things have gotten that bad budget-wise, and you have to make these kind of drastic changes over and over again. But in all, I think, as it's hard to kind of give you the full sense of what a full breakdown of all of this means as far as an episode of television. I guess the easiest thing that I can kind of give you to kind of take away and how a writer's room works, and how, as a young writer, your understanding of a writer's room should work, is that everything that gets up on that board is by way of a pitch. It's by way of what you probably do in class sometimes, which is, well, what if this happened? What if that happened? What if the character took this route or took that route? What I will say, which is so much the difference between being in film school and being in a writer's room, is that this is very technical, all of these details. So if I make a pitch, and this is me younger in my career, I would always make a pitch in a way that was very much about what was going to happen. Well, what if the character lets someone borrow a jacket, and then that person gets arrested with the jacket, but there's something important in that jacket the character needs back? Now, that's not a bad pitch, but in the context of becoming a professional, what's the entire goal of the board is to make something for which, if I had to explain it to the director, if I had to explain it to a production manager, if I had to explain it to an actor, if I had to explain it to an executive, I'm helping that process of what we're making. So if the pitch was about a jacket and the character gets arrested and somebody's in it, there's nothing emotional behind what I'm saying as a pitch. Now that might work, but what needed to be said in the pitch was, in order to get our character to a place where they're more desperate and they're uncomfortable and they have to make decisions that they're not comfortable making, which is what we're trying to get the character to that place. What if we do this? What's effective in that way is there's a language of storytelling that needs to be communicated to everyone in a room or everyone in the process of what you're making. Currently, I sold a TV pitch to Showtime that is based on a property owned by Jay-Z called Streets is Watching. And in the pitch, which is, it involves kind of the hip hop police and a bunch of other things, the pitch needed to involve explaining the hip hop police. It needed to involve explaining emotionally, what does that mean? That there are no country music police, there are no rock and roll police, there are hip hop cops. This exists. There are police officers who have a wall chart of rappers and people that they hang out with. As you can see with what happened recently to a couple of New York rapper. This exists in the world. And so in explaining it, I then have to take account, which is where I've gotten to in my career, to understanding you also need an emotional context for what you're going to see on screen. And I have to say that was something it took me a lot longer in my career to get to, because it took me a lot longer to understand, because but friends of mine that work in this industry that have gone to film school, and we watched movies when they come out, and we still like that kind of film school kind of feel and vibe. We always have these constant conversations about our interpretation of what we would like to make and what we are making. And what we come out of these conversations, it's always a certain sense of there's a language of communicating ideas that you have to start to become adept to. Now, I can't give you a pitch on this is how you need to have an LA meeting, or the first time you ever meet with the showrunner, say this, or all of these things. I can't naturally say that. I think I always say about voice is there's something about you that makes what you make. And what you want to completely understand is how this industry sees things in the way that you don't, so that you see where they kind of meet in a certain place. I wrote Brooklyn's Finest, and I thought I was making a movie about morality and how police officers who are normal people are tasked with something greater than who they are. And I remember the executive that brought the script, and he said, you know what's great about the script is you can take 3 actors who have big fees, and we only have to pay them 25% of them, because you wrote a script where they're the main character, but they're only 1/3 of the project. It's like, he was like, this is so great for our math on how we make movies. And this is kind of the industry that you're in. You might make an artistic choice that somehow meets on the level of commerce. And then you might make an artistic choice that goes against commerce in some way. That you are constantly trying to understand what that commerce language is. That's kind of what your career becomes in a way. So if I offer anything here that kind of is helpful, I'm glad it helps, but ask any questions you possibly have.
Let's get some questions. Y'all can type them into the box if you'd like, into the chat box, or just jump on the mic. Go ahead. Michael was in your place not too long ago, right? And you want to be where Michael is. So now's your opportunity. You have his full attention.
Hi, sorry, it's a little noisy where I am, but I just wanted to know, since your trajectory moved pretty quickly, like writing your script and getting an agent and then moving to LA to do television, how did you adapt to the writer's room being like kind of like a rookie? Like, how did you navigate and adapt and like rise to the occasion since you kind of move so fast? It's like, it seems like you were just thrown in. So how did you adapt to that and succeed at it?
I made a lot of mistakes. That's how I adapted. I constantly made mistakes. Here's something that exists in writers' rooms that did not exist where I grew up. There is no hierarchy where I grew up. If you have a good idea, you have a good idea. Or if you feel like talking, just talk. And so I was a staff writer, and that was not the position that I was supposed to be in. And so I was very talkative in the room, and I was very opinionated in the room. I'm probably a little too opinionated, but if I have to say anything about that, which is that's a gift and a curse in a way. Honesty is definitely something that's needed. That's why I think I keep saying you have to find your language in this space. I'm very comfortable if someone says to me, I don't understand that, or I don't get it. Not everybody else is comfortable with that. Sometimes some people can take that as being harsh and being a little like combative. And so that was probably what I learned immediately, which was there's a better way to get to the solution. And if you want to have a career as a screenwriter, your job is probably about problem solving, and then you have to figure out your language of problem solving. If there's any immediate note I can give, which is something someone told me, which is it's not a help to the process if you identify the problem, but you don't give a solution. So if there's anything in any brainstorming situation that you're in, if you see something as a problem, if you say, well, that doesn't work because of this, you haven't helped move the ball forward. If you actually don't even have to say why something doesn't work, you can just offer an alternate take on it and always try to move towards a solution. Because if I offer a solution, even if that doesn't solve the problem, it at least puts you in a direction where someone might critique what I said and said, I like that, but what if we do this? Or this is good, but if we go here, it's always about moving the ideas forward. Hopefully that answers your question.
You did. Thanks.
Michael Davis wants to know, are you more passionate about film writing or TV writing?
You know what? I think to me personally, I don't really see a difference at this point. And I think the reason I say I don't see a difference, well, that's for me. I think the difference is I've reached a level where I can craft an idea and I can pitch an idea and sell an idea. When you're new in this business, you can still do that. It's a lot harder of a road to get to. So if you're new in the business, it's a little bit more of, I would love to write on that show. I'd love to work on that show. I'd love to work on this. That's more of your aim and your trajectory. And to me, I see so many television shows that, my God, when I started, they just didn't exist. They couldn't go this place. They couldn't do what they can do. And the film industry, it's so extremely hard to even pitch on what that looks like now, currently. And I think no one can. Meaning the typical motion picture industry is changing so much that now when you say the movie industry, you have to say Netflix and Hulu and all these other places as well. I don't see a difference, but to me, there's always something more intimate about a film as a kind of finite, in an hour and a half, 2 hours, this is what I had to say to the world. And it's done. I mean, it's how many people are going to make Breaking Bad and The Sopranos? Like, it's just a harder road. That's an amazing piece of work. And it blows you away that 6 seasons, could be done. But to me, there's something great about, hey, this 2-hour thing, I love watching it when it comes on every Christmas. Like Die Hard, you just love it that it keeps coming back over and over again, and it kind of becomes this finite thing. I love The Sopranos, but it's hard to share it as easy as it is to share a movie.
Got time for a couple more.
Yeah, I had a question. Thank you first for talking with us. But I was curious as to, especially in the beginning when you moved out in your career, this the workflow between jobs, and how those were coming about. Were those sort of fostered through your manager or agent, or and like how did you go about building those relationships with, say, Paramount and Warner Brothers? Was that just through being sort of invited just to or for a treatment or something like that through your manager?
It's two things. One, when you have an agent or a manager or both, they usually facilitate your kind of meeting people in the industry. You know, I had the extremely fortunate that I was on like the front page of like the Hollywood Reporter. That was kind of in the not the earliest part of my career. That there's a part of my career where I wrote the script, Brooklyn's Finest, and they got me a TV job. And you get one kind of meeting that way, which is let me just see your face kind of meeting. And then the movie was sold and Antoine Fuqua was going to direct it. And there was these actors' names in it. And then it was different meetings at that point that kind of changed and moved things around. The thing I will say about relationships is I really was such a Brooklyn mindset. I didn't understand that when you're meeting people, one of the biggest things about this industry is, you know, you spend a lot of time together. So people sometimes, the camaraderie or that certain sense that certain people think of having to be on is a little bit more about, you should be comfortable working around me. I'm going to have some jokes to tell. I'm going to have good energy. It's not going to be time that's poorly spent. And, you know, when you think about it in that perspective, it does make you feel like, oh, that's an easier thing to sell, which is, I don't want my time wasted either. If I have to have a phone call with someone every other day, I'd rather it be pleasant and interesting than not to be interesting. My trajectory is very different from what most people do. What most people do when they come out here is they work as an assistant. They meet other people the same age or the same kind of trajectory moving up, and they all kind of help and pool and get each other into that place. Every version of being social helps. I would say your agent is going to take you as far as then your ability has to take over at that point. But again, even you know, something I do now, your friends, the people that watch the movies you watch the television shows you watch, constantly get in communication with them. I have some friends out here, we've worked on television shows together, and when we have ideas, we used to sit down, have coffee, and talk about them to kind of get our excitement up and get ourselves comfortable talking about our ideas. One of the things that's really difficult to do is to have an idea in your head by yourself, and then all of a sudden, for the first time, you know, you're talking to an agent or a manager, you're uncomfortable because you've never talked about it with anyone else. It's almost like this conversation in your head that you're sharing with someone else, which is not a dialogue of two people being creative. So that social part of it, it's actually something I suggest you work on, but not work on like being false or being devious, but work on and being comfortable expressing your ideas and why you want to make what you want to make.
Cool. Niall wants to know if there are any books or sources that helped you grasp a better understanding of television writing and the culture of the writer's room.
I would say I've taken my period of reading, like Save the Cat. That's a book. I think I've read an audiobook of Robert McKee's story, which you know how to say, it's so fascinating to me. Robert McKee's never written a screenplay. He is almost unanimously the authority on storytelling out here in LA. Yeah, I know so many executives who every year they go to a seminar over and over and over again. I don't discredit what he has to say. To me, what he has to say is great for executives. It's great in getting this kind of collective idea of scenes and stories and structure and moving things along. And it actually extremely helps you. To me, if any moment you're going to have a note from an executive, Robert McKee is extremely helpful in that space. There is one book I really do like. I might get the name wrong, but if you Google it, it's something, I think it's called Bitter Script Reader, or I'll try to find a way to pass it along. And what it really does is something I didn't know existed, which is a script reader, which is when you submit your script to someone, be an executive, be it whoever, even an agent, they might not read your script. They might read the coverage of your script, which is that there's someone who reads your script and then they write up 2 pages explaining your writing and grading you on the script. And the book, I think it's called The Bitter Script Reader, or 500 Ways to Get Past a Script Reader. I'll send the full. And I found that to be something that opened my eyes because, again, when I write, I was usually writing from my perspective. I was never aware of someone who's critiquing it and why and for what reasons they're critiquing it. And this book kind of gives you a breakdown on a script reader sees it this way. A script reader will note this. A script reader will wonder about this change. And the script reader will wonder why nothing has happened in your story for 10 pages. Like it was extremely helpful.
Cool. Mike Davis wants to know again if becoming a showrunner is a goal of yours at all. He's curious because he wants to go in that direction, but what advice would you give towards becoming a showrunner?
I mean, I'm in the position now, if we get a green light from Showtime, that I'll be a showrunner. I think it's taken me this long to really understand how difficult television is. This is such a hard question. It's almost impossible to answer. This is what a showrunner is. It's a director and a producer first, and a writer last. You know, it's the I think at this stage in anyone's career that you guys are in, that's a goal definitely to have. You have to learn so many of the steps in between that it's scary how many steps there are. Because one of the things that's really difficult to me, and I'm not a showrunner yet, so I've helped out on a staff, but to work for writers who work for you, who you could fire, whose work you have to critique, having to explain to executives your perspective and point of view. There's so many of those aspects that are so daunting. I think the one thing that would help anyone who wants to be on the road to being a showrunner is whenever you watch a television show that you like, take into very serious account when you look at the names of the writers who are there in the first season and they're not there later. That there is a kind of changing volume of what voices are given to a show. Why there are certain people, like you think of Terrence Winter, Matt Weiner on The Sopranos. There are these kind of writers who kind of are on board this massive thing, and then they go off to craft their other voices as well. Like it is kind of easier for me to do because sometimes you get to meet these people out here, but writers who have worked on The Shield who end up being showrunners, writers who worked on other shows, it is a very difficult task to understand how someone else writes and how to make them write with you. So the first task you really need to understand is your own writing and your own voice, and how that can then make you a good writer, so then you know how to hire good writers.
Cool. And then last question, Shaquan wants to know if you have any tips about how to write character motivation in an emotional context.
Ooh, character motivation in an emotional context. It's a tricky one to unpack. I think to me, if I always go to, I've learned so much from so many actors. Character motivation, emotional context. What I would say, I remember a story someone told me about Weeds, and about an actress getting very upset that she had to go looking for her keys. And when she opened a drawer, the drawer was empty except for the keys, and she got very upset. And she said, I'm creating a very real person. And if I'm creating a real person, I need to have a real desk, not a fake desk. There would be a ton of shit in here, and I'd have to find my keys. I can't do my job unless you give me the space to do my job. So in that context, always think of the actor and what the actor's trying to bring out. Character motivation and emotional context. Usually, if you want to know how motivated your character is, you usually give them two things that they want, and then you make them have to choose one over the other. That's kind of the easiest, simplest way to kind of get that across, which is, I really want this and I really want that, but now I have to choose one or the other. Which one do I want more? And what does that say about me that I want that more? I guess that would be the simplest, vague way for me to explain that.
Michael, would you ever consider being a teacher?
I would at a certain point, I was like, I would love to get rid of doing all of this. Well, at some points I get that way.
Because you're great. This is great. I learned so much.
Cool.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate you coming to join with us. Can he type the name of the book? Yeah, Courtney, I think he's going to send it to me. They're asking about the script reader book.
Cool.
Yeah, I think he's going to send it to me, and then I'll send it out all to you. Also, it's okay if I can share your some of this Empire Breakdown
Yeah, definitely.
material? I can share it with everybody.
Yes.
Cool. Again, thank you so much, Michael. That was awesome. Definitely learned a lot. And I think for me, it's really exciting. I think for everybody, it's really exciting to have somebody who's like in our position not too long ago, who's now having the kind of successful career that you're having. It shows us that it is possible. So that's really cool.
You guys are going to give me a job one day.
Cool. Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you guys. Take care.
Take care.